Buying an abandoned, mid-century asylum building through my long-term real estate investments seemed like the ultimate financial play to remodel it into high-end modern apartments. But the freezing, heavy silence of the massive brick complex began to slowly wrap around my mind like a tight grip during my very first weekend. Staying on the property completely alone because the sheer size of the dark corridors and the empty wards felt entirely unnatural after sunset. The structural framework of the old institution was incredibly solid, ancient, and dark, but long after midnight, when the wind outside suddenly dropped to a dead calm and the ambient temperature inside the building began to plummet rapidly, I noticed a bizarre, muffled thumping noise echoing down the long, unlit corridor that sounded exactly like a heavy human body desperately throwing itself against the thick concrete walls from the inside of a sealed room. Armed with my high-powered tactical flashlight and a heavy iron crowbar, I cautiously walked toward the abandoned psychiatric ward at the very end of the hall, tracking the erratic, wet thumping sound through the darkness until I stood directly in front of a heavy iron security door that had been completely welded shut with thick steel bars and reinforced chains since the late 1960s. With my heart hammering violently against my ribs and cold sweat freezing on the back of my neck, I used a heavy crowbar to pry open a small, rusted ventilation slot in the solid iron, fully expecting to see old water pipes or collapsed brickwork, but instead looking into a wide, pitch-black isolation room where the stagnant air smelled intensely of ancient dust, copper, and dried sweat from decades ago. I pointed the bright light beam into the far corner of the sealed concrete room, and I froze in absolute, paralyzing terror because the entire back wall was lined with massive, cracked mirrors, and every single mirror perfectly showed the reflection of an empty room, except for the one directly opposite my flashlight, which clearly showed a towering, emaciated shadow entity standing right behind my own back. Before I could even turn my body around to run back down the long corridor toward safety, a freezing, wet breath violently hit the back of my exposed neck, while a loud, echoing screech of tearing metal completely shattered the quiet of the asylum, and the heavy security door behind me violently slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping me inside the absolute darkness with the entity forever. Driving home late at night after an intense, bone-crushing martial arts training session at the gym, I decided to pull my vehicle into an old, brutalist, multi-level concrete parking garage downtown to inspect a strange, rhythmic knocking noise coming from my rear tire, because the sound had been getting progressively louder with every kilometer. The entire concrete structure was completely deserted and bathed in an eerie, flickering yellow light from the buzzing halogen bulbs overhead. But as soon as I stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing night air, a heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the empty parking decks that made my own footsteps and shallow breathing sound unnaturally loud against the cold walls. Armed only with my smartphone flashlight, I bent down to inspect the rubber wheels near the dark wheel well, but my heart instantly skipped a beat when the motion-activated security lights on the empty level directly above me suddenly snapped on, one by one, accompanied by a heavy metallic dragging sound that echoed down the concrete driving ramps from the dark top floor. Panicking with a sudden, overwhelming wave of adrenaline, I jumped straight back into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy doors shut, immediately staring at my digital dashboard camera screen to check the exterior surroundings, only to freeze in pure, paralyzing terror because the wide-angle lens clearly showed a towering, faceless entity with impossibly long, twisted limbs standing perfectly still directly outside my dark driver's side window. Before I could even turn the key or put the car into reverse to speed down the narrow exit ramp toward the safety of the main street, the vehicle's entire digital display began to violently glitch and distort with a heavy layer of analog static, and the faceless creature slowly raised its elongated, pale hand, tapping its razor-sharp black claws against the glass while the car's engine completely died, leaving me trapped in the pitch-black concrete maze forever. Working a lonely night shift as a cargo supervisor on a massive, rusted deep-sea container ship, crossing the freezing Atlantic Ocean seemed like a peaceful way to clear my mind. But the absolute isolation of the dark water became completely terrifying when a violent storm rolled in, and the massive steel ship began to creak and groan under the immense pressure of the black waves. The entire lower cargo deck was packed with hundreds of old, stacked metal containers from all over the world. But during the silent hours after 3 a.m, a bizarre rhythmic scraping noise began to vibrate through the steel floorboards, sounding exactly like a large iron tool desperately scratching against the inside of a sealed container located at the very bottom of the cargo hold. Armed with a heavy metal wrench and a bright tactical spotlight, I climbed down the steep iron ladders into the deepest, darkest storage level of the ship, tracking the echoing scraping sound through the humid, oily air until I stood directly in front of an ancient, unlabeled shipping container that was covered in heavy rust and chains. With my hand shaking violently from the freezing cold and pure anxiety, I realized the heavy padlocks on the container door had already been violently snapped open from the inside, and as the ship rolled heavily to the side, the massive steel doors slowly creaked open on their own, revealing a pitch-black interior that smelled intensely of old salt water, rot, and deep ocean decay. I shone my bright spotlight beam into the dark, wet container, and I froze in absolute, breathless horror because the walls were completely covered in hundreds of deep claw marks, and right in the center of the floor lay a torn, dripping diving suit from the 1950s. But before I could step back, a wet, muscular shadow entity with glowing white eyes lunged out from the dark, slamming the heavy container doors shut behind me as the ship plunged into the next wave.